Today we are going to start with amazing panelists in an interactive panel titled Making the Case for Science, organized by U15. It will be amazing. Please don't forget to tweet your favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and #CSPC 2023, and also please fill out the evaluation survey for this session. Your feedback is very important to us. I hope you enjoyed this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Alors, bonjour à tous et toutes, et un grand merci d'être venus ici en si grand nombre ce matin. Bravo, félicitations. Nous sommes tous ici. The mention of our being on the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquian territory always reminds me of the fact the word Ottawa, as you know, in Algonquian means to exchange. And I always feel that we're carrying on a tradition in terms of exchanging ideas, exchanging ways in which we can make a better future. And so thanks to all the organizers and everyone for allowing us to have this opportunity, and all of you for coming this morning. Yesterday we had a great day. I think it was so much fun to exchange again and talk with people. But I think we all admit that we live in a really turbulent period, and I think there are challenges, concerns around the world, and certainly in Canada, certainly in the United States, everywhere, about how the 21st century is unfolding. I don't think any of us had a really linear view of how science and research was going to make a better future, how better understandings of the past and present was just going to lead us to a better future. I don't think we had a simplistic notion of that, but I think we had the assumption, at least, that we could really see steady movement toward making that better society, and increasingly toward a sustainable, prosperous, resilient, just world. But I think now we're feeling, at least, that all of us have to do more, we have to do better. And so today, I think our topic is around this whole question of how can science and research really enhance our efforts? What do we have to do in terms of our classic effort, at least over the last half century or so, to double down on better understandings in order to make this better future, and advancing science and research, advancing our knowledge, advancing our understanding to get us where we want to go as a global, successful village, as was called back in the day. So I think to do that, we thought we were just so lucky this morning to have really leading voices from the world of journalism, world of politics, the world of research, and three individuals whose experience and kind of interactions over the years really overlapped like crazy with those three sectors. And I think that gives us a really ideal potential here for a discussion that can, I think, advance us in significant ways. So first, let me just welcome back again to Ottawa Dr. Sethuraman Chanathan, who insists on being called Dr. Panch or Panch, and I know to us here in Ottawa, we had the pleasure of being colleagues in the 1990s, and it's so wonderful to see him back here, and he's kept such close touch. I do want to just emphasize, though, that he was poached in 1997 by the Arizona State University, and this was before the creation of the Canada Research Chairs, before all the initiatives of the late 1990s that created Canada as a country that really pursued global excellence. And I think it's just so wonderful that those connections have been maintained, and we're so proud to see you back here as the 15th director of the National Science Foundation, and someone who has deep familiarity with both Canada and the United States, and I think that's really, really exciting. It's also fun to welcome back to Ottawa after how many weeks now? Leslie Church, who we all had the pleasure of working with here in Ottawa as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, but also in guises before that. And I want to shout out and say thank you for your work when you were with procurement as chief and got us through the pandemic in terms of getting those vaccines that we all, I think, really have benefited from and across Canada. So thank you for your work there. As you know, Leslie has decided to step back from her role here in Ottawa to come back potentially, hopefully, in playing a different role. And she's now a candidate for the Liberal nominee in in Toronto St. Paul's for the Liberals to replace Carolyn Bennett, and we can stay tuned as that develops over the coming months. And sitting next to me is Paul Wells, who needs no introduction. His I think 19 years at Maclean's, really, I think, framing a lot of the public debate in Canada, not only about politics, but very, very broadly. As you know, Paul has a very, very broad view of how he can contribute to a better level of conversation, better level of understanding in Canada. And all of us now, for example, I think are, if you're not, please, it's become kind of a compulsory reading in Ottawa, his newsletter and podcast, and I think it's just a great way of giving us all a chance to kind of advance our discussion, obviously about politics, but about all sorts of other topics as well that are key to Canada's town square kind of debate we have now. So thank you all very much. To get this going, we're going to just have a discussion. I'm going to kind of pose a couple of questions, get our participants to reflect on this relationship between science, society, and we'll come at it from a couple of different angles. And then at the end, we're going to leave time for all of you, so please, we're going to try to have a good Q&A question, so get your questions ready. You get able to say them very pithily, and we'll have a good discussion. Well, let's begin first with this sense of science and research really helping public policies, helping make a better future, and so on. We've seen kind of versions of this, whether it's debate about climate change over the last 30 years, where I think scientists and researchers were trying to contribute to the public debate about what we're doing in terms of public policy and so on. And we've seen that evolve now, I think, in interesting ways, but we've also seen it in terms of the pandemic, where we heard the word science so frequently and in a different kind of a way. And so our first kind of question is to reflect a bit about what seemed to work in terms of science, scientists, researchers trying to contribute and inform public policies, and what doesn't work as well. And are there lessons to be learned as we all try to improve how we make the case and how we contribute to that making of a better future? Can we start with you, Patch?
First of all, thank you, Chad, and thanks for all of you at 7:30 a.m. Wow. So this is great that you're all here. So I just want to, first of all, say yesterday I didn't get a chance to say this. I'm grateful to Canada. I'm grateful to the University of Ottawa for giving me all the tools and the expertise that I'm able to use now to do the things that I'm doing. So first I want to express my gratitude, because the most important thing, you are expressing gratitude to the First Nations and how we are here today. And so gratitude is very important to me. So to your question, therefore, on the science, research, and policy front, and you alluded to the examples of climate and COVID. These are excellent examples of what can be done. But it takes a while. In the case of climate, it has taken a while. In the case of COVID, we didn't have the time, so it just happened. But what I see play out front and center now is the domain of AI, okay? Where I believe that policy lagged, right? And that's because there was not early engagement in terms of trying to see how we can frame the policies. And in all of this, I say that one of the things that people don't know about NSF is one of the crown jewels of NSF is the Social, Behavioral, Economic Sciences Directorate. Many people don't know that. They think NSF is about physical sciences and engineering, but actually the crown jewel, in my view, is the Social, Behavioral, Economic Sciences Directorate. I've increasingly started to talk about the SBE Directorate as not only a vertical, if you want to look at them as thematic verticals, but actually it's a horizontal that cuts through everything. So why do I say this? Because you asked the question, what works well, what does not work well? Let me tell you, when as scientists and engineers, we engage with social, behavioral, economic scientists, as well as humanists and artists, and others early in the conceptualization of the thought and the evolution of the technology, then it really works well, okay? Where it does not work well is we are isolated and we are advancing the scientific enterprise. Nothing wrong with that. It's important, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient. what we need to do is we need to be able to sensitize ourselves. And I'm very happy to see, and I talked about this yesterday in my conversation with Mona and others, is that I am finding that many of the universities now are recognizing the importance of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research, where disciplines come together naturally. And I say as investors, if you want to call NSF, and I often say NSF is only an enabler, a catalyst, and an investor at best. The real work happens in the universities. And therefore, the more we are able to configure NSF as not these verticals, but actually these kinds of verticals and horizontals and blobs, that allows the formation of these ideas. So our climate, when I came to NSF, we framed the climate and other kinds of things called Resilient Planet as the theme. The Resilient Planet theme, of course, encompasses climate, encompasses the pandemic, prediction and things of that nature. How do we build resilience? Whether it is economic resilience, resilience to the thing at hand, whether it is natural hazards, whatever you name it, right? It's building resilience. So to me, at NSF, it brings all of the directorates, not just geosciences, not just biosciences only, not just mathematical physical science only, not just computing information sciences only, not just engineering only, not just STEM education only. I'm talking about all the directorates of NSF now. And somebody's going to tell me I forgot something. And the social behavioral economic sciences, and now the technology innovation partnerships directorate also. That all of them work together seamlessly as they're conceptualizing these programs and therefore demonstrating to the community, the scientific and engineering community, that this is about people working together. So when you do that, what happens automatically is the configuration that is already being enabled in the institutions now starts to come up and present these projects in that form. I talked about the 25 AI institutes yesterday. It's exactly the same thing. Okay? In the interest of time, I'm going to tell you that that's what we need to do more, which we have not done as well. But when we do that, it really does have a different outcome.
That's terrific, and obviously puts on the table something, Leslie, that you're familiar with from, you've obviously been in politics and worked inside, but you've worked at Google, you've worked at U of T, you've been talking to across sectors a lot. What's that like? How are we doing in terms of the possibility of getting these kind of discussions going to help make a better future when we really have to think horizontally as well as vertically?
Thank you for that. No, well, look, I was thinking a lot about the COVID experience and how we wouldn't have made that through. We wouldn't have gotten through that without our scientific community stepping up in many different ways, whether that was around vaccines, whether that was around medical testing and diagnostics, wastewater, transmission flow. There were many ways that the scientific community came together and was really pulling together, rowing in the same direction to help us get through that pandemic. But I think maybe one of the challenges is how do we actually have that outside of a crisis? We want to be able to do that outside of a pandemic. And Panch, you made the point about interdisciplinary research. And one of the points I wanted to talk about too was coming from a government point of view in particular, where so much of the challenge that we face right now is around looking for opportunities to build economic growth. So we're thinking very much, what are those areas where we can help drive resources and focus in the Canadian economy to grow? Whether that's AI and technology, whether that's the future of genomics or quantum or photonics, whatever it is, semiconductors. We're always thinking that way. And at the same time, we're thinking about those social sciences and, my favorite, the dismal science, around how do we address issues like inequality, around mental health, around health policy, around housing, new solutions for productivity and construction, modular housing. How do we grab some of these issues where we're not in a crisis state like a pandemic and bring people together to talk about the importance of the scientific contribution here and bring together the research community, the university community, with think tanks, with strategic policy capacity inside of governments, with politicians themselves, and have that, that kind of crucible of discussion and policy development to actually address some of these very complicated challenges. I don't necessarily think that we've done that well. And I think a missing player in some of that too has actually been the private sector, right? And where they step in with the research community and all these other communities I've mentioned to actually have a collaborative solution to some of these very, very challenging problems. So We do need to think more about how to do that. I think, also agree with you, I witnessed the rise of some of the multidisciplinary centers across Canada where we're pulling together different areas of expertise and a regional lens on a lot of things. That is going to be very important going forward, but we have to find a way to actually elevate that voice so that we are being able to capture the knowledge and capture the innovation from that, but not just when we are on the knife's edge.
That's so important. Paul, you know, you've been really watching and involved with the world of science and research for as long as I can remember. You know, Paul, I can remember you hosted the SSHRC Awards event well over 20 years ago. I remember attending that, and so you've been watching. What have you seen? Are we facing the kind of problems that Panch and Leslie are talking about, and that we're really too inward looking at some level?
So I take this first section of the discussion as a question about science inputs into government, and then we'll get to science outputs from government. And there's a lot of good stories to tell. I prepared remarks because I'm up here feeling intense imposter syndrome. I graduated from Western with a BA in political science. The government online directory lists 1,598 people in the government with science in their title. I'm sure that radically understates the number of people who do science in government, but it's ubiquitous. It's in climate, it's in fisheries, it's in all sorts of other domains. But the interface between the science in government and the government decision makers is often spotty and limited. Last week, the Environment Commissioner, Jerry DeMarco, came out with his several audits of several departments, and the stories it tells are not always encouraging. The Fisheries Department was audited in 2016, and it was a mess, and they promised a bunch of fixes. Progress since then has been terrible. While the department now has a fishery monitoring policy, the policy isn't supported by plans and resources, and it has not been implemented. So as far as I can tell, it's a folder that has the words fishery monitoring policy on it. Fisheries Department committed in 2016 to modernize its information technology by 2020. It has now pushed the date of that implementation back to 2030. The Fisheries Department does not measure the species, sex, length, or weight of the fish that it catches, which makes it really hard to do effective stock management. This government is very nervous about public inputs it doesn't control. Like any government, it does not want to be seen receiving bad news. So one of the first things it did in government was to shut down the Science, Technology, and Innovation Council started by its predecessor. And then when I asked about that, it sent a spokesperson to lie to me about having canceled it. They told me it was still going strong, and I didn't have the heart to tell them that I had interviewed the members of the STIC Council about their farewell party. It announced in 2019 a new Council on Research and Innovation that so far doesn't yet exist. It had 2 fundamental science reviews, David Naylor's and Frederick Bouchard's. It left questions of funding out of both panels' mandates, and it asked Dr. Bouchard to make his report confidential. Fortunately, he ignored both parts of that request. The government has appointed, this is news, I'll be reporting it in a few days, Dr. Mark Walport, who's a former UK Chief Science Advisor, to investigate the role science played in Canada's COVID response. Though Dr. Walport has been in Canada interviewing public officials, and though Dr. Walport's own testimony at the UK's public and high-profile COVID inquiry made national headlines in the UK, his work here in Canada has so far not been made the object of a public announcement by the Government of Canada. It has not mentioned the fact of his investigation, his mandate, or his reporting deadline. I hope to be able to report all of those by the end of the week. If we're going to talk about COVID as a model for science input, so many people did such heroic work on that. But we should also view COVID as a set of lessons that hopefully can be learned and applied in the future. Science wasn't really ready for COVID. The literature on layered non-pharmaceutical interventions was sparse. The evidence on masking was more sparse and initially contradictory, which led a lot of people to question their faith in the science they were getting. That's nobody's fault, but it's a thing that happened. Economic modeling of a potential pandemic's impact was completely wrong. And what expertise was available, and despite what I just said, there was an awful lot, government's receptor capacity for easy-to-understand reasons that are universal was essentially degraded through lack of use. Jane Philpott told me that when she was a health minister, every time she went to a G7 or G20 health ministers conference, they would spend a half day gaming pandemic response, which is an enormous investment of the international health decision-making community's time and energy. When she went home to Ottawa, nobody in her department, at the center, no journalists wanted to hear any of that. And so it was essentially grain thrown on concrete. There were successive pandemic response plans, but nobody who hadn't prepared them paid them any attention. Nobody practiced responding to pandemics. So it was like sending a Steinway piano and a book of Beethoven piano sonatas to the government every few years. If nobody studies and practices, that piano is not ever going to sound like Beethoven. Government wants advice it can take or leave because it is constantly overwhelmed with advice. Everything that scientists want to tell government, homeless advocates, housing advocates, people who want a stronger military, they match everything you throw at the government and more. And so the government doesn't want to be seen grappling with these decisions too much. It wants everyone to go through channels. This forces a decision on anyone outside government who would seek to influence it. Do you produce advice the government can take or leave in hopes that your advice will be so persuasive the government will take it, unlike all the advice that they didn't take before? Or do you take care to do the things that any government likes least? Report publicly and critically, speaking to the public about the government rather than to the government about the public. I'll be back later with more.
So there, I think that's a good way of saying this. And okay, Leslie, you're going to be knocking on the doors, and you've already started and engaging with people. What's the kind of federal responsibility here? It seems to me, we do live in a world of misinformation, disinformation. Some people call it the post-truth era, and so on. There's a public debate out there now that's gotten real complicated, and presumably it's in the interest of all of us, and certainly in the interest of government, to be able to make rational arguments about what they're doing, various policies, and so on. What can we do to kind of enhance that whole science policy side such that we do, in a more focused way, take advantage and start to build a better society and make better policies in all our departments? And how do you see this at the moment?
Well, look, I would say a couple things. I mean, first of all, I think that, just picking up a little bit on where Paul was coming from, I think that this government, and I can kind of say this now, having stepped out of it for a few weeks, has been a huge defender and investor and believer in science. And I think that if we look at the investments that have been made over the past, number of years, they have been historic investments in science and research by the government. I think that the very difficult thing that we have to grapple with as a country right now is actually thinking a little bit about where we are in the kind of post-COVID world. And as all countries are grappling with, global inflation, they're grappling with the fallout of major fiscal investments in pandemic supports. They are grappling right now with very unforeseen events like the conflicts that we're seeing right now that are, again, create pressures on governments. I think we look at that and then we think about a little, like, how is Canada unique in all of this? And where are those opportunities for us to look at some of the challenges that we can actually address here in Canada? And there are a few that I think are spots where we need to look very closely as a country at what we are doing and how do we actually use science to address them. And I think we need to look very closely at the energy transition, because I think that is happening different in Canada than in most countries around the world. We have a different economy. We do not have a political consensus around the energy transition. That is making it more challenging. There's a lot of room for innovation, technology, and scientific progress here in these areas. So it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge for us to wrestle with. I think we have to think a lot about our business investment climate. Government has stepped up. Private sector has not. That is a long-standing, decades-old problem in Canada. And we are not going to be able to move the dial on scientific research until we actually have the private sector in Canada investing more in R&D than they are right now. And they're not. And a lot of our big industries are not huge R&D intensive industries. And so we're going to have to wrestle with that. We have to think about proximity to the US. Pat, you're living in a country right now where the IRA and the CHIPS Act have actually changed the playing field. And Canada is most exposed to those because of our proximity. You know, it is easier to pick up and move from Ottawa to the US than it is from Europe or from Asia, whether you're an individual or whether you're a company. And then lastly, I think just our geography overall, which is the pandemic has shown and actually has accelerated our vulnerability in our supply chains and our resiliency. We are not part of a big bloc like the European Union. We are dealing with growing US protectionism, possibly a Trump 2.0 situation. These things are very, very challenging for us as a society, as an economy. And science can really be at the heart of this if we actually step up and look at, here are the challenges that we're facing, but here's actually what we can do if we bring together our scientific resources and if we try and address these issues and look at science from a strategic point of view as something that is actually going to help us address these fundamental issues that Canada is uniquely dealing with right now.
Thank you. Pancham, I want to pick up on Leslie's point here, which seems to me so important, because what I hear you saying, Leslie, is that, you know, for decades we had globalization and the world is going to become a great integrated place, and it's, you know, we're all going to live in this great intertwined world and so on. Your point is that domestic capability, the actual strength of each country matters perhaps more than ever now in this globalized world. And you mentioned the IRA. I know in Canada we've been mentioning a lot the menace, frankly, of chips and science. That in fact, you know, we talked about the brain drain in the 90s. We sense at least a serious brain drain at risk here. And I know in Washington, when we were down there, the calculations were that in order to implement chips and science, it was basically going to take some serious additional highly qualified talent. And Canada looked like a really interesting spot. And I know our Coalition for Canadian Research that has so many participants here, and we've come together, this has been one of the things I think that really ties us is the highly qualified talent. And is Canada at risk at some level in this new world in which, as Leslie's saying, domestic capability, our ability to have a strong country within our geopolitical borders, and then we can engage internationally. But if we're domestically weak, we're going to get vacuumed. We're going to become a kind of a colony in the 21st century. What do you make of that?
So, you know, those are all very good points. And, you know, one has to build domestic capacity in all nations as it relates to the very specific expertise that is, you know, naturally possible in those locations. I always say, even in the United States right now, since I came to NSF, I think I mentioned this briefly yesterday, I've always felt that innovation is everywhere. I said that yesterday, the operative word. And how do you surface that innovation? It can't be just top-down, it's got to be bottom-up. So our Regional Innovation Engines program essentially surfaced these unbelievable ideas that each region said, this is what we are really good at. And we looked at that and we were just amazed by the potential in all of these regions. I said, I will tell you a story, and I will tell you the story. There are a couple of stories, but I'll tell you this story. One of the Regional Innovation Engines, Type 1s, was from the state of Nevada. And I went for the launch of that Regional Innovation Engine that NSF invested in. And it is amazing to watch that Nevada is the only lithium mine in the nation. Okay? And now they're going to build the largest lithium mine in the state of Nevada. It turns out that the University of Nevada, Reno has a research center which is focused on not only how do we extract lithium in a green way, how do we process it, how do we recycle it, okay? Full life cycle, okay? It turns out that they're involved in that. It turns out that the University of Nevada, Reno is now launching a program on battery technologies as a concentration in their engineering program. It turns out that the community college is now developing the skill sets necessary, the skilled technical workforce necessary for the complete life cycle of lithium mining, okay? It turns out that the Tesla Gigafactory is located right there. Okay? Now, NSF was able to, through this small investment, we didn't plan this way. They all came together, and the governor's office is now investing in this, right? This is just one example. I invite all of you to go and look at the regional innovation engines in the NSF website. It's public. The unbelievable innovation activities. So why do I say that? In Canada, for example, yesterday I was visiting University of Ottawa, my alma mater, and in our place together. And I see, for example, compound semiconductors, right? So there are places in which you can find the niches that makes this very compelling to have something developed, in each of the locations. But I want to also, Chad, take a moment to talk about what we have learned. The AI debate that we're having right now, I'm so pleased because I work with all my counterparts. One of the things I did when I came to the agency, the first 2 weeks, I picked up the phone and talked to every other agency leader, NOAA, NASA, NIST, DOD, DARPA, you name it, right? I talked to every one of them to see how we can hyper-partner together, okay? Because we are not silos, we are all one, okay? So now, in the AI realm, we all work together, Department of Energy and others, work together, thinking about what we need to do across agencies. Then, if you look at the partnership with industry, I was mentioning this yesterday, President Biden invited the AI companies to the White House to see what kind of commitments that they can make when they're talking about how to work together in finding creative solutions and policy making towards what we need to do with AI. And then if you look at Senator Schumer, and I talked about the AI caucus in the Senate, okay, Senator Rounds and Senator Heinrich on both sides of the aisle, and then this unbelievable interest in terms of senators attending these sessions on AI, all the way from AI 101 to many panels that I've participated in one of those panels. And these are senators just not just show up, they're so interested. They not only show up, they're engaged on a bipartisan sense. The reason I say this is there is clear awakening of the importance of engagement of all sectors if you're trying to find real solutions, right? You need to work with scientists, engineers, practitioners, industry, entrepreneurs, venture capital systems. You have to work with the economic development ecosystem, states, of course, the administration and the Congress. I have found this in AI, the coming together and the awakening of what we need to do together in terms of framing policy. This was true of chips and science too. I participated in that quite a bit. I think the evolution of the chips and science since my arrival in NSF, it was just timely that it all happened. And I can tell you, I talked to a lot of the congressional folks, both on the Senate side and the House side, and their interest, their engagement, their commitment. And my dear partner is Secretary Raimondo, Gina Raimondo, and I are partners. We work very closely together, Secretary of Commerce and I, and of course other players. So why do I say all of these things? This is a moment of hyper partnership. That's the only way. That's the only way you're going to advance national priorities, national objectives. And when I talk about partnership, it's on both sides of the aisle, even in the political sense, right? So we need to not just, as I said yesterday, pointing a finger at others is very easy, but there are 3 fingers pointing back at you. Just remember that. So I keep repeating this because I keep telling this every day. It's easy to point fingers at others. It's easy to do that. I mean, everybody can do that. But what are you doing to change that? Particularly people who have the ability to change something. Let's talk about that. So I challenge people in all spheres to see how do you reflect upon what can we do to be constructive in terms of lifting the conversation. It's very easy to bring people down. It's very easy to talk about all the negatives. It's very easy to be pessimistic. I will agree, I'm an optimist. The Science magazine did an article the moment I took over, and they said, an eternal optimist takes helm at NSF. I said, I will take that accusation.
And I love the expression that the world of achievement belongs to the optimist. So I think that's great. But the message you're giving is, and picking up on this, is inclusion. You're going across sectors. You talked about private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, and so on. But it's geographically as well. Yeah. I don't know if you're the first NSF director to spend time in Nevada, but my guess is you're reaching out, tapping the entire pool of talent, engaging with communities and so on, is part of this vision of building a strong domestic capability but doing that in a very, very inclusive way, which is obviously, I think...
Chad, I will just add this. When I came to NSF, I said this, and I said I can say this and be real about it. I said I'm so grateful for the United States for having given me the opportunity that has put me in the place that I am today, and I feel compelled to serve. Okay? Good. But I said, for far too long, the United States has substituted domestic talent with global talent. This is an unacceptable future for any nation. What we need to do is to unleash every ounce of domestic talent everywhere across our countries, and then welcome unbelievable amount of global talent from everywhere across the globe into the country. But this has got to be an additive game, not a substitutive game. I have challenged this, and at NSF, we have done everything to make sure that every state in our nation, every territory of our nation is tapped in and given the opportunities, whether it is rural, urban, across the broad socioeconomic demographic, or across the rich diversity in terms of ethnic and other kinds of diversities across our nation. This is exceedingly important. If you're really serious about workforce, talent, domestic capacity, let's first talk about what we are doing to unleash the domestic talent and giving them the opportunities.
Thank you. Okay, Paul, the initial picture you were painting here, and based on the evidence and so on, was clearly that we can do better. Listening to all this, what comes to mind?
Well, so it's important to recognize that we often do fantastic. One of the most ambitious pieces that I wrote this year was about the Acceleration Consortium at the University of Toronto, run by Dr. Elena Spiro-Guzik, who's a chemist and a fan of lucha libre wrestling, who received a $200 million CIFREF grant, the largest grant that any university in Canada has ever received from anyone for anything. It got them from the federal government. And they're doing amazing things there with artificial intelligence and material science. What I left out of that story, because you're boring if you only ever complain, is that in the nature of CIFREF, first of all, it was developed by the Harper government. Secondly, it's designed to concentrate large amounts of money in isolated places, so only 11 campuses have ever received a CIFREF grant, which means dozens of campuses haven't. And they are left with the good work of the granting councils, where funding has been flat since 2018 and had been declining before then. 2018 was a good year. So a hell of a lot of good science gets done, but I know that people come here every year for this conference wondering and making the argument for why can't governments put more of their investment into curiosity-driven research, the humble, ordinary investigator, versus project-driven research and priority-driven research, where the priorities and projects are selected according to government priorities. These are the people who know that Geoffrey Hinton, who is the object of a fantastic, long profile in the New Yorker this week, spent many years in the desert and had long crises of faith and was seen as a bit of an outcast in the research community because neural networks were seen as an absolute epistemological dead end. And yet in 1991, Geoffrey Hinton got $100,000 from NSERC because we had a system that follows ideas rather than trends. And we still do, but perhaps not often enough. I thought I would spend a little bit of time explaining why that's not always the case. The research community in Canada had 5 really good years, 1997, just after Dr. Panch left, to 2002, essentially because, to caricature, because Jean Chrétien was the brother of a medical researcher. It took 14 years after 2002 to realize that the incredible momentum of the late 90s was starting to dissipate, and the research community went through several stages of grief. Denial from 2003 to 2008, anger in the later years of the Harper government, shock at the realization that the Trudeau government didn't represent an automatic improvement over the Harper years, and since then, bargaining. The quintessential, those are the Kubler-Ross stages, you're right, I'm a geek. The quintessential feat of bargaining that I've seen was the Globe article 2 weeks ago, authored by Stephen Toop and David Naylor. 7,500 words on the benefits of curiosity-driven research. The tone behind that essay was, if we just explain this one more time, maybe this time they'll get it. Counter-argument is they're just not that into you. Here's what government hears when scientists make this kind of argument. What governments, plural, hear is, please give us an ever-growing amount of money. We're not sure who will get it, but we'll make sure that scientists make those decisions, not you. In the end, something wonderful will happen, we're not sure what. The fact is, and the thing is, it's true. The thing is that actually does work. But governments are naturally going to be skeptical of it, and they've been increasingly skeptical since 2002 because of two big changes. First of all, the mania for accountability. The sheer horror of being caught misspending a dime anywhere, which means that you want belts and suspenders to justify every single expenditure. And even more so, a growing obsession with narrative. Large organizations everywhere, and very much including governments, and very much including governments in a hotly partisan, polarized situation, want to tell an essentially heroic narrative of government as the motor for progress in Canada. Canada is a better place today than it was last week because we're in power doing good things. And so this notion that if you give us some money, it'll work out fine, trust us, is very hard to process and very easy to reject, even by essentially benevolent governments. Which is why Kirsty Duncan's first reaction in 2017 to the Naylor report and its call for a National Advisory Council on Research and Innovation was, this is a quote, "An unelected body making funding decisions, that's not okay." Or a spokesman for Pierre Poilievre last week, when MPs from 3 other parties wrote to the finance minister asking for science funding, the opposition leader spokesman said that the Conservatives are not interested in throwing undefined amounts of fuel on the inflationary fire. It's true there are governments everywhere, elsewhere in the world, that are able to think more long term. But here I really think the fight for curiosity-driven over project-driven research is one that can only win very occasional victories. And that's why I begin to advocate in places like this, that the people who are in the business of looking for government money need to shift their own energies into coming up with more large, interdisciplinary, project-driven projects, rather than ceaselessly advocating for curiosity-driven funding, because they simply are not going to understand. They simply speak an increasingly different language. It reminds me, finally, of when I used to work in large news organizations. A peculiarity of Ottawa bureaus for any news organization is that they're run out of Toronto and Montreal by people who don't understand government. And they would always call us with stupid ideas for what to cover. And what I would always tell my colleagues is, if we don't come up with our own ideas, they're going to tell us what to do. And I think that mindset is, if you don't start to suggest, if you don't get more and more into the business of proposing big project-driven research for your institution, it will be suggested to you by people who know less about your field. And so I'm essentially arguing for a change in narrative to match the way people here think about narrative. And I'm always happy to talk about that in greater detail.
Thank you very much. Quick comment from Leslie before we open it up, and if you can get your really pithy questions in, we'll see how many we can get to. Leslie.
Well, I just wanted to say one thing about this, which is I actually think that there is a recognition that you can do both. And I actually also, Dr. Bouchard is in the front row here, and I credit that report too, which shows that you can't do the mission-driven research without the curiosity-driven research with it. I think that there is actually that understanding, and there is a balance between wanting to make sure that someone else makes decisions about what science we are doing, and also here are the spots where we actually think there's a Canadian advantage and a real opportunity that we want to kind of double down on. So I actually think that you can do both of those. I think one of the challenges for government right now is, as I would actually, when meeting with different institutions, would often say would be, pretend you have $1. Where does that dollar go? Is it, in curiosity, how much of it goes to curiosity-driven, how much of it goes to mission-driven? How much of it is going to infrastructure, to indirect costs of research, to graduate students, to student financial aid? The list kind of goes on, and it's actually where I think that a community like this can be useful, and kind of picking up on your AI example, is help us with those roadmaps that take that dollar and show us the best way to get to the objectives at the end. Because a lot of times what I think you are on the receiving end in government is great ideas, but the challenge for us is often to kind of take that down into the roadmap of what is the funding that we're doing? What are the objectives that we're laying out? What is the legislation that needs to get passed? It's very crunchy. And a lot of times we don't get to that level of implementation granularity of, okay, so we want to make these investments, we want to make headway. How do we actually get there in really concrete terms and have a kind of a consensus around that?
But I'm not going to make the comment because I want the questions. But whatever question you ask, I'm going to make that comment. How about that? So you feel you asked a question, I'm going to say what I want to say. Okay.
I have a dozen counter arguments, but the thing is, I've been writing them for 20 years, and people who talk like Leslie are making the decisions. So listen to her.
I want to also give a shout out to the survey of parliamentarians that was done, and there's copies up here by the Canadian Science Policy Centre in Chelsea and so on. I went to the launch of this, and very quickly, you've spoken to a lot of parliamentarians, as we would say, in your context throughout Congress, all the representatives, the senators, the government folks, and so on. Is Paul and Leslie, have they...
So here is what I'm going to say. When I came to NSF, NSF is the gold standard for curiosity-driven, discovery-based exploratory research investments. It is the agency in the United States and the only agency that invests at scale in all parts of science, engineering, and technology all across the nation. We all know that. But one of the things that I did when I came to NSF is I said that this message of NSF also doing translational, applied, and research that actually impacts humanity, society is not as well, the stories are not as well told. So I just made up, as I make up all things, I just made up this term called the DNA of NSF. The one strand of the DNA is the curiosity-driven, discovery-based explorations. The other strand of the DNA is use-inspired, solutions-focused translations and innovations. These are not a pipeline. This is a mistaken notion that people have, always think that that's the way it works. You do curiosity-driven work, then somewhere, something becomes applied and then translated, and then company gets started or industry gets licensed. Doesn't work that way. The real world is about the symbiosis between the two, like the DNA. That this fuels that fuels this, and it's a constant yin and yang that gets you advancing in science technology. So I said the DNA of NSF is it does both. And I give examples of them. So let's take the Gravitational Observatory, LIGO. People who think that is a fundamental theoretical observation that was then tested by building the infrastructure of LIGO. But guess what? Building the infrastructure of LIGO actually resulted in some very interesting outcomes like quantum sensing and so on. Okay? So this is not just about this or that, as Leslie said. It is about this and that with a lot of synergy and symbiosis. People just don't give enough credit for that. Let me tell you something about two stories of NSF. Two graduate students of NSF, for NSF undergraduate students, turned to be Larry Page and Sergey Brin. In 1994, wrote a proposal to NSF called Digital Libraries Project. We funded it. In 1999, they wrote the final report of that project, and they said we founded a company called Google a year earlier in 1998, and the rest is $1 trillion history. Viterbi came up with a fantastic algorithm, and he came to NSF in the 1980s. for a small business innovation research investment. We invested in that. Today, Qualcomm is several $100 billion of a company. SBIR was a program actually incubated by NSF. People don't know this. Now it's in all other agencies across and emulated by many other countries. So I-Core is a program incubated by NSF, and TIP is a directorate incubated by NSF. Regional Innovation Engines is incubated by NSF. The reason I say this is the stories need to be told. We don't do a good enough job of telling the stories of what curiosity-driven research resulted in what happened. In COVID, the PCR test that we are celebrating today, that genesis of that was a bacteria in Yellowstone. I mentioned this yesterday. That was invested in by NSF as a curiosity-driven research in 1960s. We don't talk about this. I call them tire tracks. You need to build tire tracks of people who we have, leaders of industry and others. Go back and you will see how they got touched by NSF or NSERC investment. We don't tell the stories. We don't do a good enough job of taking what happens in the outcome today and try to have the tire tracks back to all the investments that were made. We don't do a good enough job of telling the story. So I tell NSF, it's exceedingly important for us to capture those stories and talk about this to the policymakers. And what I do, as you said, with parliamentarians, I go with senators and congressmen and women all over the country with them in their districts to show the impact of NSF. It's our responsibility. Whether it is the universities or funding agency leads, it's our responsibility to do the thing that we need to do for people to appreciate, the investors, to appreciate enough to want to invest more. It's very easy to say, but they should understand the value of science. It's our responsibility to demonstrate the value of science. This is the moment. This is U15. I'm telling you, every university, and then not just U15. I challenge the chancellors and presidents of AAU and APLU. I told them, you have to make sure that it's not an elite club of U15. It's a U100 or U200 that you all need to reach in and build those connections. That's what we need.
And obviously, I think that's why at U15 we've certainly redefined our role and to see us as working for the entire research ecosystem and collaboration from coast to coast to coast. And we want to thank you again. I want to thank the Coalition for Canadian Research for all their work in supporting our activities. I know the hardest thing that I have to do this morning is to bring this session to a close with this clock that's got this red button now flashing at me. I want to thank Dylan Hanley and James Hammond from U15 for their work. I want to thank all of the organizers of this wonderful conference. I want to thank all of you for coming this morning, and a special thanks to Paul, Leslie, and Panj for such an amazing session that could go on for all day. Thank you so much. That was just true.
One thing you learn as a professor is filibuster with your comments, so there's no questions.
We also appreciate U15 for organizing this wonderful panel. Please don't forget about the feedback and survey, and enjoy the rest of the day.